They brought in a bulldozer at 6 a.m. and started tearing down my fence like they owned the place. Neighbors screamed. I ran out in my pajamas, heart pounding. And guess what? The machine they used to destroy my property had my company's logo on the side. Yep, they tried to destroy me using my own bulldozer. That was their first mistake. I made sure they'd remember the next one for the rest of their lives. The fence went up in early spring, a clean cedarwood privacy barrier that followed all local zoning rules and stood well within the bounds of my property line. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't tall enough to block sight lines or violate height restrictions, and it had already been signed off by the city inspector with all the paperwork in place. For the first few weeks, everything seemed fine. Neighbors commented on how nice it looked. Some even asked for the contractor's number. But apparently, not everyone was pleased. It started with a passive-aggressive note in my mailbox, unsigned, typed, and riddled with vague complaints about unsightly alterations to community appearance. A week later, a formal letter came from the HOA citing a pending review of my fence due to aesthetic concerns. That phrase alone felt suspiciously empty. No actual violations, no code citations, just their opinion masked under bureaucracy. Knew exactly where it came from. Karen, the unofficial queen of the HOA board. She lived 2 houses down and had made it her mission to micromanage every blade of grass on our street. She was the type who measured how long someone's trash bins sat on the curb and filed noise complaints if a dog barked more than twice. When she saw that fence go up, I could almost feel her blood pressure spike from across the lawn. Still, I thought logic and law would win out. I went to the next HOA board meeting fully armed, with printed permits, signed contractor agreements, and photographic evidence of the fence being built within regulation. I calmly explained everything. Materials used, height measurements, property setbacks, and the fact that the city had inspected and approved the build. The board sat in silence while I spoke, barely hiding their disinterest. Karen smirked through my entire presentation like it was an inconvenience to her calendar. When I finished, the HOA president glanced at Karen and then said, "We appreciate your initiative, but our board also values the visual harmony of the neighborhood. And your fence? Well, it's quite disruptive." Disruptive? The same design had been approved on 3 other lots in the development, including Karen's friend's yard 2 streets over. I brought that up only to be told that each situation is evaluated individually and precedent doesn't guarantee permission. It became clear they weren't there to listen or resolve anything. They were circling the wagons around Karen's personal agenda. I asked point blank if there was a written rule I had violated. Karen answered for the board. "The fence just doesn't fit the character of the community. No law, no policy, just opinion." And since when did she become the authority on neighborhood character? I left that meeting furious, but still hopeful. That logic would prevail. I figured at worst, I'd get a strongly worded warning letter and have time to appeal. Instead, 3 days later, I got a knock on the door from a man in a high-vis vest and a clipboard. He wasn't from the HOA, he was a subcontractor. He handed me a single-page demolition order with my property address typed across the top. "We're scheduled to remove the structure this week," he said casually, not realizing what he was dropping in the middle of. The document had no official city stamp, only the HOA letterhead and a printed signature from the treasurer. It referenced board-approved corrective action, as if this were some legitimate municipal action. My name wasn't even spelled right. They hadn't notified me directly. No certified mail, no email, no posted notice. Just a stranger at my door telling me my legally permitted fence was now slated for destruction. I asked him who authorized the job. He said the work order came from a third-party contractor that does regular business with the HOA, someone I'd never dealt with. I demanded he put the project on hold until I could get legal counsel involved. He nodded but said, "I'm just the delivery guy. They'll probably send the crew out in a few days unless someone cancels the job." By the time he left, my mind was already racing through the possibilities. They were really going to tear down something I paid for, something I had a permit for, because Karen didn't like how it looked, and they were doing it without so much as a formal hearing or mediation. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. This was about power. About an HOA board abusing its authority to make examples out of homeowners who didn't bow down. But they'd underestimated one thing. The equipment they planned to use? It wasn't just any bulldozer. It was my bulldozer. They just didn't know it yet. The demolition didn't happen with notice or warning. It happened early in the morning, hours before most people had even gotten out of bed. The HOA had decided to act swiftly, likely to avoid confrontation or protest from neighbors. What they didn't expect was that the very action they took in secret would end up exposing them more publicly than they could have imagined. By mid-morning, the damage was done. The custom-built fence was no longer standing. What once was a carefully installed cedar barrier was now a pile of shattered wood, broken posts, and splinters scattered across my backyard. The destruction wasn't surgical. It was aggressive, careless, and complete. Nothing had been preserved. The posts had been uprooted, the panels crushed. Even parts of my lawn were torn up in the process. This wasn't just removal. It was erasure, and there was no mistake. This had been carried out by heavy machinery. That's when the first shock hit. Images began circulating in the neighborhood. Group chat, photos and videos taken by early risers and neighbors who had witnessed the chaos unfold. But it wasn't just the damage that caught my attention. It was the equipment used to do it. In the photos, a yellow bulldozer sat parked on the edge of the street. Its arm still had bits of wood clinging to it. Dust coated the tracks. But what stood out most was the logo printed on the side of the machine. Clear, unmistakable. It was my company's name, not a copycat, not similar. The actual branding of my heavy equipment rental company. The HOA had unknowingly used one of my own machines to destroy my property. The implications hit immediately. The HOA hadn't rented directly from me. They had gone through a regional third-party broker, likely, in an attempt to shield themselves from liability or to cut costs. The broker, unaware of the specific location of the job, had assigned one of our bulldozers from the general rental pool. Standard practice. But the HOA didn't do their due diligence. They didn't think twice about whose machine they were putting in motion against a homeowner. That mistake opened a door they would wish they'd never walked through. I moved fast. The first step was documenting everything. I downloaded every image and video I could find. I cross-checked the equipment's unit number, which was visible in one of the zoomed-in pictures. I logged into our internal asset tracking system. There it was, matched to a contract issued just 3 days earlier to a subcontractor working under the name of Community Grounds Management, LLC. A shell contractor name, not the real crew. Likely just a placeholder group working exclusively on HOA-backed projects. The rental agreement had been approved without scrutiny. But now that I knew the machine's ID, I could trace every detail. Who authorized the dispatch, when it was loaded onto the flatbed, when it was delivered, and even who signed for it on delivery. Our fleet management system tracked all movement via GPS. I printed out the coordinates and timestamps showing that our bulldozer had gone directly from our depot to my street. The signature on the delivery receipt was another piece of gold. It matched the treasurer's name from the HOA. I contacted my operations manager and explained the situation. We immediately flagged the job as a conflict of interest. Under our internal policy, no equipment is permitted to be used in any dispute where ownership ties are involved. This clause existed to protect clients and ourselves, but in this case, it gave us immediate grounds to freeze any future usage. Our manager began pulling all active rentals linked to the subcontractor's account. Within the hour, we had revoked access to multiple machines, issued a temporary ban on their account, and alerted our legal department. The situation wasn't just personal anymore. It was becoming a liability issue for the HOA and the broker. They had initiated unauthorized destruction of private property using equipment that now placed them directly in my legal crosshairs. Worse, the HOA had made no effort to verify the legitimacy of the demolition order, and the contractor had no official permit to conduct structural removal on private property without the homeowner's consent. That alone constituted grounds for multiple lawsuits. By noon, I had everything I needed: photographic evidence of destruction, proof of machine ownership, chain of custody for the equipment, a rental contract tying it all together, and most importantly, a clear case of gross negligence on the part of the HOA and their affiliates. They had bulldozed my fence in violation of property law, HOA policy, and civil codes. But they didn't just do it recklessly. They did it using my own tools. And that meant they didn't just attack a homeowner, they triggered a business and legal response they were woefully unprepared for. The HOA board had operated under the illusion of invincibility for far too long. Their confidence came from years of unchecked power, quietly bullying residents, issuing arbitrary fines, and enforcing aesthetic standards that existed more in opinion than in any written rule book. They believed their actions were above consequence, shielded by bureaucracy and the assumption that no one would ever challenge them with real force. But their latest move, destroying my fence with my own equipment, crossed a line they couldn't quietly tiptoe back over. I initiated a full internal audit through my company's logistics and legal teams. We started by reviewing the rental chain: who placed the order, who signed for it, who paid for it, and who authorized the job. The name listed as the rental customer was Community Grounds Management LLC, but this wasn't a verified business with any long-standing record. A little digging revealed it was a recently registered entity, barely 3 months old, with a vague commercial landscaping description and no operational history outside of my town. That alone raised red flags. The delivery records, however, didn't lie. Our rental system had time-stamped GPS logs showing the bulldozer being dispatched from our lot, delivered to the site, operated for less than 3 hours, and returned without any scheduled job completion forms. The most important piece was the delivery receipt, signed by none other than the HOA treasurer, someone with no legal authority to sign commercial rental contracts under a false entity name. The signature matched board documents. We scanned their annual budget reports filed with the city and confirmed the treasurer's name, email address, and even compared handwriting samples on prior HOA communications. The evidence was indisputable. The HOA treasurer used a fake contractor name, funneled community funds into a job that targeted a private homeowner, and signed off on unauthorized use of commercial machinery without permits or insurance coverage. In legal terms, this was textbook fraud, and it came with potential civil and even criminal consequences. I contacted legal counsel immediately. Within hours, we had drafted and served a cease and desist order to the HOA board demanding an immediate halt to all related construction activity, plus a formal accounting of HOA spending over the last 60 days. The letter cited destruction of private property, fraud, misuse of community funds, and unauthorized operation of heavy equipment. But we didn't stop there. We also prepared a lawsuit seeking damages. The claim would go beyond the cost of the destroyed fence. It would include business damages, brand misuse, emotional distress, loss of property value, and punitive charges related to falsified documentation. Every bit of it backed by paper trails, time-stamped rentals, signed logs, and eyewitness accounts from neighbors who saw it all unfold. Meanwhile, my company took action on the operational side. We pulled every active rental within a 50-mile radius that was linked to HOAs or vaguely defined landscaping contractors. That included backhoes, trenchers, graders, and compactors. Projects all over the region stalled overnight. Crews showed up to job sites only to find equipment had been remotely locked out and immobilized via onboard telematics. Our system was built with compliance protection in mind, and in this case, it worked beautifully. The ripple effect was immediate. Phone calls poured into our rental office, frantic contractors demanding to know why equipment wasn't working. One particularly angry caller even mentioned a halted renovation of a community clubhouse, which matched a project publicly announced by Karen at the last HOA meeting. They were expecting to unveil upgrades in a few weeks. Now their entire schedule was derailed, their vendor relationship blacklisted, and the press was starting to sniff around. It didn't take long before local journalists began asking questions. A viral neighborhood forum post had captured the destruction in real time, and a few well-placed anonymous tips, strategically submitted by some very upset neighbors, pointed the media to public records about the fraudulent contractor name and the HOA's unpermitted demolition job. Suddenly, the story wasn't just a neighborhood dispute, it was turning into a public scandal. The HOA board held an emergency closed-door meeting. They didn't realize that as a homeowner, I had the legal right to request meeting records and audio recordings, which I did through a formal demand letter. They'd tried to erase the evidence, but the community pressure was mounting, and cracks in their facade were beginning to show. By now, they knew they were dealing with someone they couldn't intimidate. Someone who had not only the legal resources and business infrastructure to push back, but the documentation, timing, and leverage to expose their misconduct publicly. Their arrogance had led them to believe that this would be just another case of HOA overreach. But this wasn't just about offense anymore. It was about accountability, and now I had them cornered. When institutions panic, they don't admit guilt. They start negotiating. That's exactly what the HOA did once the legal documents landed and the pressure escalated. The board, once defiant and arrogant, now pivoted into damage control mode. The HOA president sent an email, thinly veiled in legalese but oozing desperation, requesting a private meeting to reach a mutually beneficial resolution. Translation: they wanted to pay me off quietly and shut me up before this exploded any further. The offer they put on the table was laughable. A reimbursement check covering the cost of the damaged fence, a vague promise to revise future demolition procedures, and a politely worded request for me to drop all claims, legal and public. It was insulting. They thought I'd trade silence for a quick payout. What they failed to grasp was that the situation had moved far beyond a broken fence. At this point, they were dealing with fraud, illegal property destruction, unauthorized contractor activity, and evidence tampering, all tied together by a paper trail they could no longer bury. What they didn't know during that meeting was that I had leverage they hadn't even imagined. One of the subcontractors they worked with, unknowingly caught in the crossfire, had reached out to me directly, furious after being ghosted on a payment from the HOA. During our call, the subcontractor vented freely, unaware that I was recording for legal purposes. In the process, he revealed that the HOA treasurer had openly admitted to ordering the Bulldozer job through the shell company and knew from the beginning that the equipment came from my fleet. I didn't reveal the recording right away. I let them talk themselves in circles during our meeting. I listened while they spun half apologies and suggested miscommunications. Then, when they finally asked if we could all just move on, I played a clip from the recording on speaker. It was short, crystal clear, and damning. The treasurer's voice, unmistakable, confessing that they got the bulldozer from the same guy they were messing with, meaning me. The room fell silent. The next morning I filed formal charges: destruction of private property, fraudulent use of commercial equipment, illegal demolition without municipal permits, civil liability for misrepresentation. I attached the recording, delivery receipts, GPS logs, and HOA meeting minutes where the project was vaguely referenced, but never approved by a full vote. I sent copies to the HOA, to the city's code enforcement department, and, most critically, to a local news station that had already been sniffing around the story. Within a week, the fallout began. The city launched an official investigation into the HOA's practices, Turns out, the board had overstepped their authority more than once. They'd been quietly removing structures from homeowners' properties without proper notifications for over a year. The bulldozer incident just happened to be the most public and most traceable act of overreach. Under pressure, 3 board members, including the treasurer, resigned immediately. They claimed it was to avoid distractions for the HOA's mission, but the community knew better. Then came the cherry on top. One of my employees flagged an active job site using one of our machines, a grading project near a community park, that had been paused due to the equipment lockout. Turns out, the same subcontractor who had ghosted payment and worked with the HOA had resumed operations. And yes, they were still using my bulldozer. So I pulled the trigger on the repossession. Order. We dispatched a flatbed with remote override instructions. Our team arrived on site, flashed the contract breach clause, and lifted the machine straight off the job. 10 minutes, tops. The crew on site watched helplessly as their project ground to a halt. Again. I later found out the HOA board had promised residents that the new park path would be ready by summer. Now they were scrambling to explain why the equipment vanished and why a company they'd partnered with was suddenly blacklisted across the region. By now, the story had gone viral on local social media. Residents began digging into past HOA behavior, random fines, surveillance complaints, architectural review denials. My incident had become the match that ignited years of quiet resentment. A petition circulated calling for a full recall of the board. New elections were demanded. Transparency measures proposed, but I wasn't done yet. I instructed my legal team to move forward with the civil suit, not for the money, but to force the deposition process. I wanted documents exposed, emails subpoenaed, and board members under oath. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about stripping away the false sense of immunity these HOA leaders thought they had. Because once you bulldoze someone's property using their own machine, you better be ready for what comes next. The fence that once stood as a simple boundary line had now become a symbol, not of property lines or aesthetics, but of power, accountability, and resilience. The old fence was gone, bulldozed without consent. But in its place, I built something far stronger, a message wrapped in lumber and concrete, tall enough to cast a long shadow over every decision the HOA dared to make moving forward. This time, I didn't just rebuild, I fortified. The new fence was constructed under full municipal permits, double reinforced with steel posts, engineered to meet every single HOA guideline down to the letter. I even consulted with 2 separate zoning specialists to make sure there wasn't a square inch they could complain about. Every plank, every bolt, every security measure was HOA-proof. And yet I didn't stop at compliance. I upgraded the perimeter with motion-triggered lights and installed industrial-grade sprinklers programmed to activate when movement was detected near the fence's outer edge. Not the kind you see in gardens, these were commercial deterrents designed for farmland, capable of spraying with enough force to make trespassing a very wet, very public mistake. It wasn't about spite. It was about deterrence. Clear, legal, non-aggressive deterrence, with receipts and documentation to back it all up. The fence became a local landmark of sorts. Neighbors would walk by and chuckle when the sprinklers kicked in unexpectedly on HOA committee members doing inspections. Even the local news station came back to do a follow-up segment, this time focusing on how the power dynamics in the neighborhood had shifted, with homeowners finally demanding fair treatment and oversight. The lawsuit settled quietly out of court, but not without some public consequences for the board. My legal team pushed until they secured a 6-figure settlement, not only for the damages to my fence and business reputation, but also for defamation and emotional distress. Part of the agreement included a printed apology in the HOA newsletter, which the board had to circulate to every home in the community. It read like a hostage confession, sterile, corporate, and stripped of any real emotion, but the admission was there in ink, and that was enough. The treasurer was barred from holding a board position for 5 years following the settlement. 2 other board members resigned permanently to avoid depositions. The remaining leadership was voted out in a special election that drew the largest turnout in the HOA's history. A new board was installed, made up of actual homeowners, not self-important retirees trying to micromanage lawns and fencing color tones. And the new board? They were extremely polite, extremely respectful, and very aware of how quickly things could escalate if they ever stepped out of line again. Meanwhile, the ripple effects worked in my favor. The media attention didn't just make the HOA infamous. It turned my bulldozer company into a regional talking point. Calls came in from landowners, contractors, even municipalities who respected how I handled the situation with a combination of strategy, legal pressure, and calm authority. Our story went semi-viral, and for once, the business benefited from outrage. Rentals increased by 27% in the quarter following the incident. We even launched a new campaign, Equipment You Can Trust, Boundaries You Can Defend. Cheesy? Maybe. Effective? Absolutely. But perhaps the most satisfying part wasn't financial or legal. It was personal. The woman at the center of this, the HOA's unofficial queen bee, the self-declared enforcer of community standards, couldn't stomach the outcome. After losing her influence, her social clout, and the ability to dictate who did what with their own property, she listed her house for sale. Rumor was she couldn't handle the hostility, though nobody had been hostile to her. It was the loss of control that did her in. She moved out quietly, with no farewell note to the community she once ruled. Her replacement? Ironically, a former contractor who had also dealt with HOA overreach. His first act on the new board was proposing a motion to cap fines, demand full transparency in contractor dealings, and create a digital record of every HOA decision moving forward, open to all residents. The vote passed unanimously, so now the fence stands, not just as a boundary, but as a monument. A reminder that power without accountability crumbles when faced with truth, documentation, and a bit of heavy machinery. It wasn't revenge, it was justice, with receipts. And if another HOA or anyone else ever thinks about coming for what's mine again, they'll quickly realize one thing. I don't just build fences, I build consequences. And I've got the bulldozers to back them. Up. Subscribe to the HOA stories for more true tales where justice bulldozes arrogance, one outrageous HOA at a time.